Today, we're diving into the story of the most remote developed nation on Earth. And get this, its entire human history fits within just the last 700 years. It's an incredible story. So, let's get into it. The story of New Zealand.
Yeah, this quote really nails it, doesn't it? New Zealand's history is this dramatic story of two peoples from completely different worlds. You've got the Polynesian Maori, who were here first, and then the Europeans, who came much, much later. And their journey, from first contact to the birth of a modern, independent nation, is just unlike anything else out there.
Okay, now here's a fact that is genuinely hard to wrap your head around. Think about it. While empires were rising and falling all over the world, the Romans, the Egyptians, all of it, this huge, fertile land was just empty. No people at all. It was a world just waiting, a total blank slate until incredibly recently. So, where do we even start this story? Well, the answer is surprisingly recent. The whole human chapter for New Zealand, it only kicks off about 700 years ago. In the grand scheme of things, that's nothing. It's just a blink of an eye. This timeline really shows you just how isolated early New Zealand was. So, after those first Polynesian voyages, Maori culture developed for more than 300 years, completely on its own. Can you imagine that? A whole society evolving without any outside contact for that long? It wasn't until 1642 that the first European ship even showed up. And then another 127 years passed before Captain Cook arrived and really kicked off the start of permanent change.
So, these first encounters, they were absolutely critical. They really set the stage for everything that came next. We're talking about everything from the very first misunderstandings to the huge permanent changes that happen when two completely different cultures collide.
And you can really see this turning point in these two encounters. First, you have Abel Tasman in 1642. His visit was brief, it was violent, and it basically put a giant danger sign on New Zealand for other Europeans. It delayed any real interest for over 100 years. But then comes Captain Cook, and he was different. He was methodical, he mapped everything, took a scientific approach, and he kind of demystified the place. And that's what really opened the floodgates for the wave of Europeans that came after him.
So, this new era of contact, man, it was a real double-edged sword. On one hand, you had trade. Maori got new metal tools, which were great, but they also got muskets, and that just unleashed this incredibly brutal period of intertribal warfare, the Musket Wars. And even worse than the guns was disease. European illnesses just ripped through the Maori population. It was absolutely devastating. But in the middle of all this chaos, something really important happened. Missionaries actually worked with Māori to create a written form of their language. And because of that, centuries of oral history was saved for the future.
So you've got this chaotic situation. Disease, war, settlements popping up with no real laws. Somebody had to try and bring some order to it all. So they drafted this one document. It was meant to be the foundation for the future. The irony, it ended up becoming the very thing that sparked a devastating war.
And this is it, the Treaty of Waitangi. It's New Zealand's founding document, and on paper, it looked like a great deal. It was a promise to protect Maori land and all their rights. They'd become full British subjects, and in return, they'd accept British governance. The whole thing was sold as a partnership. But there was a fatal flaw, a huge one, and it's something that still echoes in New Zealand today. You see, the treaty was written in two languages, English and Māori, and they didn't say the same thing. The English version says Māori gave up sovereignty, complete control, but the Māori version used a word kawanatanga, which means governance, a totally different concept. So Māori chiefs thought they were agreeing to share power, not completely sign it away.
And the fallout from this one translation error was just devastating. As more and more settlers arrived, the pressure for land grew and grew. And eventually, those two different understandings of the treaty just exploded. The result was the New Zealand Wars. Decades of brutal fighting, with Maori tribes taking on the full military might of the British Empire.
Okay, so while all this conflict over land and sovereignty is playing out, there's a whole other story happening at the same time. Remember those European settlers? A lot of them were running from their own tough lives back home. And now they were building a brand new society from the ground up, and they were dead set on making it different from the one they'd left behind. Just try to imagine it. Getting on a boat for 3 months. A dangerous journey to the literal other side of the planet. What would make you do that? For a lot of these folks, it was the dream of escape. Not just from being poor, but from that rigid British class system where you were basically stuck in the life you were born into. New Zealand was a chance to start over, to build a society on their own terms.
And here's the cool part. Because this new society was mostly built by regular working people, there was no aristocracy calling the shots.
It basically became a giant laboratory for new social ideas. They brought in a minimum wage, an 8-hour workday, protections for unions, stuff that was way ahead of its time. But the most radical, world-changing thing they did, that was still to come.
1893. That's when New Zealand became the very first country on Earth to give all women the right to vote, a true global first. It just set a completely new standard for what equality could look like.
So, as we roll into the 20th century, New Zealand starts a new chapter. This is going to be the century where it goes from being just a loyal little part of the British Empire to a nation that's really determined to carve out its own independent path.
Yeah, the 20th century really put the country to the test. New Zealanders fought for Britain in 2 world wars, and that really helped forge a sense of national identity. But back home, big changes were happening too. A lot of Maori began moving from the countryside into the cities. This led to a powerful new civil rights movement, one that forced the country to finally look at the broken promises of that founding treaty. And that all led to the creation of the Waitangi Tribunal in 1975, which was set up to investigate and deal with those historical wrongs.
But you know, the biggest shock to the system didn't come from a war. It came from a trade deal. For decades, New Zealand was basically Britain's farm. Then, in the 70s, Britain joined what would become the EU. And just like that, snap, New Zealand's main economic lifeline was cut, overnight. It was a massive crisis that forced the entire country to completely reinvent itself.
And right in the middle of all this soul-searching and reinvention, New Zealand made a move that would define it on the world stage. Remember, this is the height of the Cold War, and New Zealand declares itself a nuclear-free zone. This was way more than just a nice gesture. It was a defiant stand, telling the world's superpowers, not here. Now, this policy put them on a direct collision course with their biggest ally, the United States. See, the US Navy had this policy where they would never say if their ships had nuclear weapons on them or not. So when New Zealand said no nuclear-powered or armed ships in our ports and refused to back down, the US just suspended its security alliance. And just like that, for the first time ever, New Zealand was really truly on its own.
And right at this moment, as the country is navigating this brand new, independent path, something completely shocking happens, something nobody could have predicted.
In 1985, French intelligence agents snuck into Auckland Harbor. They planted 2 bombs on the Greenpeace ship, the Rainbow Warrior, and sank it. A photographer on board was killed. The ship was about to sail to protest French nuclear testing in the Pacific. Let's be clear about what this was: an act of state-sponsored terrorism. And it didn't come from an enemy. It came from a country that was supposed to be a friend.
The bombing itself was an outrage, obviously, but what came next was maybe even more shocking. The reaction from New Zealand's traditional allies, like the US and the UK, was quiet, muted, and that silence sent a really chilling message. It told New Zealanders that when push came to shove, their big allies would choose strategic relationships over condemning an act of terror on their soil. That moment, that's what cemented New Zealand's resolve to go its own way, to have a foreign policy that was truly its own.
So you go from being the last place on Earth settled by people, through this incredible history of conflict and innovation, to a nation that in the end decided to follow its own conscience. And that whole story really leaves us with a big question, one that applies to any country, really. How do you balance what you believe in, your core principles, with all the pressures you face from your powerful allies?